Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Wednesday? Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indiana, Johnny in PA, Bella in Florida, Lorraine in Texas. My mom is 101 years young today. Ruth Bat Sal. Wow. Happy birthday to her. And may she keep enjoying life to 120. And let us say amen. Sharon in New Jersey. Chaim in Florida. Moshe in Brooklyn. Nancy in North Carolina. Norman in Ohio. And Lester. See not seems. See not seems. Not sure what that means. Frank in San Pedro. Marie in Freeport. Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to be with you. I got excused from jury duty, or rather, I did not get selected during the voir dire. What can I say? I was just very honest with the judge and the counsel for the two sides. I could not be impartial in that case. It was just a little too similar to something that happened in my family, not my immediate family, but in my family. It was something I had some knowledge of. I'm also a lawyer. I mean, I'm a recovering attorney for 30 years, but I did go to law school. I graduated, passed the bar, and practiced for a year and a half before I left to go to film school. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but I think when I said no, I cannot be impartial. That was, at that point, I was destined to be leaving that courtroom, which I'm quite happy about. It just seemed like a really boring trial for weeks. And I'm glad to be out of it and here with you and can keep other commitments that I have in the next few weeks. Okay, we are continuing our discussion of Mishna 8 here in chapter 8. And with God's help, we'll finish chapter 8 tonight and open chapter 9. We're in tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. And we continue our discussion what to do with intermingled offerings, intermingled blood of offerings, and portions of blood, or collected blood that left its area. Yesterday we were talking about if the blood of the soul of an offering was collected in 2 cups, 1 cup left the temple courtyard, the other stayed in it. The one that stayed in it could still be offered. But if it was collected in 2 cups and 1 cup entered the sanctuary, then that offering is disqualified, and the cup that remained in the courtyard could not be offered, could not be sacrificed. In other words, could not be presented on the altar. We had several teachings along those lines yesterday. We continue. The Gemara returns to its discussion of the blood of a sin offering that entered the sanctuary, right? As we saw, the blood of a sin offering that's meant to be presented on the external altar, it's a regular sin offering. If its blood entered the sanctuary, that offering is disqualified, okay? So the sages taught, it is stated that when Moses questioned Aaron as to why a sin offering was not consumed, he said, behold, its blood was not brought into the sacred place within. That was Leviticus 10:18. Now, this indicates that had the blood been brought within, Moses would have understood that the offering would have been disqualified and rendered prohibited for consumption. And the Baraisa comments, I have derived only that the offering is disqualified if the blood is brought within, i.e. into the Holy of Holies. From where is it derived that the same applies if it was merely brought into the sanctuary? Right? Recall, now this is the temple equivalent. When they were in the Midbar, in the wilderness, they had the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and this is a rendering of the second temple, and Solomon's temple was the first temple. But whether we're talking about the portable structure, the tabernacle, or the first temple, or this, the second temple, in all cases, there's a courtyard where the altar is, the external altar, and then there's this inner structure, right? I mean, if you could look through the ceiling and go inside, go through this doorway, But this is divided, if you're looking down at it, that this area here, down at floor level, is the sanctuary. And then this area here is the Holy of Holies. Separated, the Holy of Holies, from the sanctuary by a curtain, the partition. Who goes into the Holy of Holies? Only the high priest on Yom Kippur with the offerings of Yom Kippur. This question came up yesterday. I wasn't sure the answer. Now I know, and it'll come up today. The other offerings whose blood is sprinkled in the sanctuary, namely the bull that is brought for a communal sin offering when the Sanhedrin got a matter of law wrong and the community relied on it, and the majority of the community came to commit a sin because the Sanhedrin got it wrong, or a high priest that committed an error, or the Sanhedrin got something wrong and the population relied on it in a matter of avodah zarah, of idolatry, then a goat is brought. Now, in all those cases, those three cases that I just mentioned, not Yom Kippur offerings, but offerings whose blood is sprinkled in the sanctuary, it's sprinkled on the curtain and on the golden altar, the incense altar. It does not go inside the Holy of Holies. Only the goat and the bull of Yom Kippur have blood sprinkled inside the Holy of Holies between the staves, those long poles that are used to carry the Ark of the Covenant, like in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. Although, by then it had been removed from the temple, but that's where the Ark stood in the midbar, in the wilderness, in the tabernacle, and during the times of the first temple, it was in the Holy of Holies. In the second temple, the Holy of Holies was empty. There was no Ark in there. It had been hidden away. Okay, the Gemara returns to its discussion. Right? So the sages taught, it is stated that when Moses questioned Aaron as to why a sin offering was not consumed, he said, behold, its blood was not brought into the sacred place within. Right? So are we talking about the sanctuary, or are we talking about the Holy of Holies? So the Brisa comments, I've derived only that the offering is disqualified if the blood is brought within, meaning the Holy of Holies. From where is it derived? That the same applies if it was merely brought into the sanctuary. Again, the blood of an external sin offering, if it comes into the sanctuary to atone, right? We learned that yesterday. If it was just accidentally brought in, not for the purpose of sprinkling inside, then the blood remains fit, or at least the offering remains fit. But if it was brought inside with the idea that it was going to be sprinkled in there, then that offering is disqualified. And now we're learning whether it was brought into the Holy of Holies or just the sanctuary, same result. From where is that derived? That it was only that this applies even if it was only brought into the sanctuary. The verse states, into the sacred place within, and this sacred place is the sanctuary. Now the Gemara questions this derivation, and let the verse state only sacred place, and it need not state within. If blood that entered the sanctuary is already disqualified, this law certainly applies if it was brought farther inside to the Holy of Holies. You'd have to walk through the sanctuary to get to the Holy of Holies. Rava says this verse comes and teaches about that verse. In other words, had the verse stated only sacred place, it would have been interpreted as referring to the Holy of Holies. The addition of within indicates that this sacred place is the sanctuary, while the term within is referring to Holy of Holies. So the Gemara cites a similar example. This is just as it is with regard to a tenant and a hired worker. As it is taught in a Baraisa concerning teruma, the portion of produce set aside, consecrated, and given to priests as their tithe. The verse states, a tenant of a priest or a hired worker shall not eat of the consecrated. So that's very interesting. Teruma is given to priests. Who may eat teruma? Only priests and their household. Who's a member of their household? Wife, children, and Canaanite slaves. Canaanite slaves. But if a priest were to, and obviously, thank God there hasn't been slavery practiced in thousands of years, but when it was practiced, it was the most common thing throughout the world, and the Torah came and set real limitations on how slavery could be practiced, including the fact that if a Jew fell into debt or stole and couldn't, what do you call it? Not reimburse, but give back what he stole, he could be sold into slavery by the court, but only for 6 years, and then he goes free. Even if, while he's a slave, he decides, you know what, his life is better as a slave than it was when he was on his own, and he wants to marry the Canaanite slave who was in service with him, with that master. So then he goes through that ritual where his ear gets sort of like a peg is driven through it with an awl in a doorway. And then he accepts to remain a slave of his master, but it is still not permanent. It is only until the next Yovel, the next Jubilee year. And for that reason, he is not considered a permanent member of the household of a priest, and therefore he cannot eat teruma. A Hebrew slave cannot eat teruma. A hired worker cannot eat teruma. A tenant of a priest cannot eat teruma. Only the immediate family and Canaanite slaves can eat teruma in the household of a priest. Right? As it is taught in a Baraisa concerning teruma, the verse states, a tenant of a priest or a hired worker shall not eat of the consecrated. So a tenant, this is referring to a Hebrew slave who has been acquired as a permanent acquisition. What I just told you, he went through that ritual, had his ear pierced. He's going to remain with his master, the priest, until the Yovel, right? But that's no more permanent than that. I.e., one who said he wishes to stay with his master. This slave has his ear pierced and he remains with his master until the Jubilee year. A hired worker, this is referring to a Hebrew slave who has been acquired for an acquisition of 6 years, the standard period of servitude for a Hebrew slave. And obviously, just regular tenants and hired workers would not eat teruma. So the Baraisa asks, well, let the verse say tenant and let it not say hired worker. And I would say if one who is acquired as a permanent acquisition does not partake of his master's, i.e. the priest teruma, as despite his status as a slave, he is not considered his master's property, is it not all the more so logical that one who is acquired for an acquisition of 6 years should not be permitted to partake of teruma? And the Baraisa answers, if so, that the verse were stated in this manner, I would say a tenant, this is one who was acquired for an acquisition of 6 years, as the term itself is ambiguous. But one who is acquired as a permanent acquisition may partake of teruma. Therefore, the term hired worker, which is certainly referring to one who is less permanent than a tenant, comes and teaches about the meaning of the term tenant, that this one was acquired as a permanent acquisition and that one was acquired as an acquisition of 6 years, and both this one and that one may not partake of teruma. And similar reasoning applies in the above case concerning the terms sacred place and within, about disqualifying blood of a sin offering that went into the sanctuary. Abaye said to Rava, are these cases comparable? How can you learn out from the tenant and hired worker examples, which we understand by interpretation to mean Hebrew slaves, that either for a period of 6 years or longer lasting until the next Jubilee, that one is kind of included within the other? Are we really going to learn out from that sacred place within refers to the sanctuary and then the Holy of Holies? Does it really follow logically? Yesterday we were talking about, we have to be careful when we're extending logic. Does it really make sense or not? Abaye said to Rava, are these cases comparable? Granted, there, the tenant and the hired worker are two bodies, and this is significant, as even though the verse could have written explicitly that a pierced tenant may not partake of teruma, from which the law of a Hebrew slave for 6 years could have been inferred, and the other case, that of a slave for 6 years, is therefore a matter that can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, it need not be stated explicitly. Nevertheless, there is a principle. At times, with regard to a matter that can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, the verse nevertheless takes the trouble and writes it explicitly. But here, the same blood enters the Holy of Holies via the sanctuary, and once it is disqualified in the sanctuary, why is it necessary for the verse to teach that this blood is disqualified when it enters the innermost sanctum, i.e. the Holy of Holies? So rather, Abaye says the mention of the word within is necessary only for a case where the blood entered the Holy of Holies not via the sanctuary. There is a way to enter the Holy of Holies not via the sanctuary. but rather in a roundabout manner. For example, from the roof or the loft of the Holy of Holies without having entered the sanctuary. Rava said to Abaye, but an expression of bringing is written in the verse, behold, its blood was not brought into the sacred place within, which indicates a standard manner of bringing it into the Holy of Holies. So rather, Rava says in any circumstance where the priest intended to bring the blood inside the innermost sanctum, it is not disqualified when it is only in the sanctuary, and therefore was necessary for the verse to teach both disqualifications. So interesting. He intended to bring it to the Holy of Holies. He only made it as far as the sanctuary. Therefore, we don't call that, that's not disqualifying. That's a fresh teaching that we haven't encountered before. Now, Rava raises a dilemma with regard to the bull for an unwitting communal sin and a goat for a sin of idol worship, whose blood should be presented in the sanctuary. If it occurred that the priest brought their blood into the innermost sanctum, what is the law? Right? So as I told you before, these particular offerings, right, where the community relied on an erroneous ruling of the Sanhedrin, a bull, if a regular erroneous ruling, a goat, if that erroneous ruling led to avodah zarah, idolatry, so that bull or that goat is slaughtered in the courtyard, and then its blood is presented in the sanctuary. So as we've seen with a sin offering, that's an external sin offering. If its blood entered the sanctuary, boom, disqualified. Here, we have an animal that its blood is supposed to be presented in the sanctuary. What if it goes even further within, so to speak, and it goes into the Holy of Holies? Will that disqualify it? That's the question being asked. And Rav explains the two sides of the dilemma. Do we say that since the verse states into the sacred place within as a single phrase, and therefore anywhere that we read a prohibition against bringing the blood into a sacred place, i.e., that the blood is disqualified by being brought into the sanctuary, we also read a prohibition against bringing the blood within, i.e., that is likewise disqualified when it is brought into the Holy of Holies? But anywhere that we do not read a prohibition against bringing the blood into the sacred place, such as with regard to those offerings whose blood is supposed to be brought into the sanctuary, we do not read a prohibition against bringing the blood within the Holy of Holies. Or perhaps, since in any event the Holy of Holies is not the proper place for the blood of those offerings, it is disqualified. Since blood, do you get the question? Since in this case the blood is supposed to be brought into the sanctuary, do we disqualify it if it is brought even further toward the holy, to a place where it's not supposed to go? Or do we say that since, well, it's supposed to be in the sanctuary, the fact that it made it to the Holy of Holies won't disqualify it? And if you say that the Holy of Holies is not the proper place for the blood of these offerings, and they are therefore disqualified, then one could raise another dilemma. In the case of the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, where the high priest does bring their blood inside the Holy of Holies, between the staves of the ark, as required in Leviticus 16:14. And then he brought their remaining blood out to the sanctuary, and then subsequently he brought it in again to the Holy of Holies, right? So once he sprinkles inside the Holy of Holies, then he leaves. Now he's supposed to sprinkle in the sanctuary. At that point, what if he went back in the Holy of Holies? Broke the procedure. Does it become disqualified then? This is blood that had a time of fitness in the Holy of Holies, but seemingly that time has passed. So will it now become disqualified by returning to the Holy of Holies? Rav explains the sides of this question. Do we say that it is its place, as the high priest is supposed to bring this blood into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur at some point? Or perhaps one should say that since the high priest has performed the mitzvah and the blood has been brought out, it has been brought out, and the Holy of Holies is no longer considered its place. And if you say that since the blood has been brought out, it has been brought out, and therefore it should not go back in, and if it does, it's disqualified, then one can raise another dilemma. If the high priest sprinkled from their blood on the sanctuary curtain, now we're on page 83a, and then brought out the blood to the golden altar in the sanctuary and sprinkled the blood there as required, but he subsequently brought the remainder of the blood in toward the curtain, dividing the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, then what is the law? Again, he brought something back after he'd already completed that part of the procedure. Is that still permitted, or does it now disqualify the blood? Rav explains the sides of this dilemma. Do we say that here, the area of the curtain and the golden altar is certainly all one place? They are both in the sanctuary, and therefore the blood should not be disqualified by being brought back toward the curtain. Or perhaps, since we call the taking of the blood to the golden altar going out in the verse, and he shall go out onto the altar in Leviticus 16:18, its return to the curtain should be considered bringing in, and therefore the blood should be disqualified. Which is it? No answers were found to these questions, and therefore the Gemara states that these dilemmas, teku, shall stand unresolved. We move on. The Mishnah teaches that the sages disagree as to the law in a case where the priest carrying the blood of a sin offering, whose blood placement is meant to be on the external altar, and he entered the sanctuary to atone through sprinkling, but in practice, the priest did not actually sprinkle the blood. So he had that intention when he entered the sanctuary, erroneous intention that should disqualify the blood, but he never got around to atoning, right? Never got around to doing sprinkling inside the sanctuary with this blood that should not be sprinkled in the sanctuary, but he never actually did it. But that was his intent when he came in the door of the sanctuary. Is the blood disqualified? According to Rabbi Eliezer, the blood is disqualified. Whereas Rabbi Shimon maintains that the blood is disqualified only if the priest actually sprinkles it in the sanctuary. Concerning this, it is taught in Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer says, it is stated here, and any sin offering whereof any of the blood is brought into the tent of meeting to atone in the sanctuary shall not be eaten. And it is stated there with regard to the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur, and there shall be no man in the tent of meeting when he goes in to atone in the sanctuary until he comes out. So Rabbi Eliezer explains, just as there with regard to Yom Kippur, the phrase when he goes in to atone is referring to the stage when he has not yet atoned, so too here with regard to the disqualification of blood brought inside the sanctuary, the phrase to atone in the sanctuary is referring to a situation where the blood enters the sanctuary at a time when the priest has not yet atoned. Sounds like intent will do. Conversely, Rabbi Shimon says, it is stated here to atone, and it is stated there with regard to the conclusion of the service on Yom Kippur and the bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering whose blood was brought in to atone in the sanctuary shall be taken outside the camp and shall burn in the fire. So just as there, the phrase to atone is referring to the stage when he has already atoned, like when this phrase is being used, it's referring to the past, he already did it. As the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur are burned after their blood has been sprinkled, so too here the phrase to atone is referring to a situation where he has already atoned, meaning he has already sprinkled. Whereas merely bringing in the blood inside the sanctuary, even with that intent, doesn't disqualify it until he actually sprinkles, according to Rabbi Shimon, but we follow Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara inquires with regard to what principle do Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon disagree. And the Gemara explains that one sage, Rabbi Eliezer, holds that one derives a case of outside, i.e. the blood of a sin offering, whose blood placement is on the external altar, which may not be brought inside the sanctuary, from another prohibition of outside, meaning the prohibition against entering the sanctuary. But one does not derive a case of outside from the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, whose blood is brought inside the sanctuary, right? If we have a choice to extend the logic of one of two laws to the unknown situation, well, we're going to extend it from the one that is most similar to the unknown situation. And the other sage, Rabbi Shimon, holds that one derives a law involving an animal, i.e. a sin offering whose blood placement is on the external altar, from another law involving an animal, the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur. But one does not derive a case of an animal from a prohibition involving a person. So he says, well, yeah, I'm going to also derive from a case that's more similar, but instead of talking about outside offerings and inside offerings, I'm talking about animal offerings versus the condition of a person. New topic. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Shimon didn't win that one. Rabbi Eliezer did. Okay, new topic. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says if the priest took the blood into the sanctuary unwittingly, right? The example I gave yesterday is like there was an emergency in the sanctuary. Somebody said, help. And he ran inside carrying a service vessel with the blood of a sin offering that had not yet been sprinkled on the external altar. When he entered, what did he enter to do? Nothing. He didn't enter with any thought in mind about bringing that blood inside for a purpose. He just forgot he was holding it when he ran inside. In that situation, the blood remains fit. When he leaves the sanctuary, he can still sprinkle on the altar, the external altar. The Gemara infers, but if his taking of the blood into the sanctuary was intentional, then it is disqualified. So the Gemara analyzes this law. Is the blood disqualified only in a case where he took the blood into the sanctuary and atoned, meaning sprinkled inside the sanctuary, as claimed by Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, or even in a case where he took the blood in and did not yet atone in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? So Rabbi Yirmiyah said that one can cite a proof from a baraisa from the fact that it is stated with regard to the Yom Kippur service and the bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to atone in the sanctuary, shall be taken in outside the camp. And they shall burn in the fire their skins and their flesh and their dung, and he who burns them shall wash his clothes. So one can ask the following question: why must the verse state, and he who burns? Now, those animals whose blood is sprinkled inside the sanctuary, the bull and goat of Yom Kippur, the bull of a communal sin offering, the goat of a communal sin offering for idolatry, and the bull of a high priest who erred. Those five. Are any portions burned on the external altar? No. Are any portions eaten by priests? No. Are any portions eaten by anybody? No. What happens after the blood is sprinkled? Those animals are removed from the temple entirely, and I think even from Jerusalem entirely, taken outside the walls of Jerusalem and burned in a special place. And the one who does the burning, his clothes shall become impure, and so they need to be purified. So here what they're asking is, why must the verse state, and he who burns? The Gemara interrupts its citation of the Baraisa to question its line of inquiry. Why must the verse state, and he who burns? One can answer that this term was necessary for itself to teach that the one who burns the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur is thereby rendered tameh, ritually impure. So rather, this is what the Baraisa is saying. Why must the verse state twice sin offering, with regard to the bull and the goat? It could have stated merely, and the bull and the goat of the sin offering. So the Baraisa answers that if the term sin offering had appeared only once, we could have learned only with regard to the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur that are burned in the place of the ashes, that they render tameh the garments of the one who carries them. From where is it derived that the same applies to the other sin offerings that are burned, the ones I named? The verse states sin offering twice to include all sin offerings that are burned. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says this derivation from the repeated mention of sin offering is not necessary. Now consider that the verse states, and the bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering shall be taken outside the camp. As there is no need for the verse to state with regard to these offerings whose blood was brought in to atone in the sanctuary, why must the verse nevertheless state to atone? This teaches with regard to all offerings that atone inside the sanctuary that the one who burns them renders his garments impure. The Gemara notes, and Rabbi Yehuda does not learn anything from the term to atone. And what is the reason for this? Is it not because he requires this phrase for a verbal analogy to derive that the blood of an external sin offering that was taken inside the sanctuary is disqualified only if the priest actually sprinkled it, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? And this answers the Gemara's question, as Rabbi Yehuda evidently follows the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And with that, we conclude chapter 8. Moving on to chapter 9 here in Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud, opening Mishnah 1 of chapter 9. We've discussed the basic concepts of this chapter before, that if an offering ascends the altar to be burned on the pyre, obviously, if nothing went wrong during the offering process, and it's something that's meant to be burned on the pyre, the altar pyre, all is good, all is well. But what if the offering was disqualified? Like, for example, it was a burnt offering, and the blood before it was presented on the altar, somebody walked it inside the sanctuary, or somebody carried it outside of the temple courtyard. That offering has been disqualified, has been rendered unfit. Now the sacrificial portion that is burned on the altar should not go up. But what if before they discovered that it had been disqualified, that it had been rendered unfit, some priest who was carrying this portion to burn it on the altar walked up the altar, right? And it either placed it on the fire or was about to place it on the fire. So, and then they discovered the error. So he walked it up the altar, went on the altar. At that point, since it's supposed to come back down, since it never should have gone up in the first place, do we bring it back down? Answer, shockingly, it depends. It depends, right? So the basic idea is that something that is unfit, even if, something that is unfit should not go up on the altar, but if it went up anyway, then the altar sanctifies it and it stays up, right? The altar adds some level of sanctity to this offering that was unfit. It shouldn't have gone up, but now that it did go up, we leave it up. It's unfit, but not too unfit. On the other hand, if this unfit offering that went up on the altar was a portion of an animal or of an offering that normally doesn't go on the altar at all, and now it was brought up here, that is too unfit. It needs to come back down. And there are some kinds of unfitness that are so unfit, not even if it is something that normally goes on the altar, but the prohibition that's been violated is so severe that even if it went up, we take it down, right? We don't leave it on the fire. We don't put it on the fire, even though it went up and the altar should have sanctified it. It can't sanctify something that is this much prohibited, and so we pull it back down. And then later in the chapter, they'll ask, well, something that is so unfit that something that should stay up. I'm sorry. So something that is unfit but not so unfit that if it went up, we don't bring it down, but somebody did bring it down, do we then take it back up? Because we should have left it up. Right? These are the kinds of questions we'll ask in this chapter. Okay, Mishna 1 of chapter 9. Certain unfit items, once they have been placed on the altar, are nevertheless sacrificed. And the Mishnah teaches the altar sanctifies only items that are suited to it. But the Tanaim disagree as to the definition of suited for it, i.e. suited for the altar. So Rabbi Yehoshua says any item that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar, for example, burnt offerings and the sacrificial portions of other offerings, which are burned on the altar. They're intended to go up on the altar. So if they are rendered unfit, but they went up anyway, these are things that are suited for the altar. The altar now sanctifies them, and we leave them up there. Right? Which are burned on the altar. If it ascended upon the altar, even if it is disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio because it was rendered unfit, nevertheless it shall not descend. Since it was sanctified by its ascent upon the altar, it is sacrificed upon it, as it is stated, Leviticus 6:2, it is the burnt offering on the pyre, P-Y-R-E, the pyre, the altar fire. It is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar, from which it is derived, just as with regard to a burnt offering, which is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar. If it ascended, it shall not descend. So too, with regard to any item that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend. Rabban Gamliel says, with regard to any item that is suited to ascend upon the altar, even if it is not typically consumed, if it ascended, it shall not descend. Even if it is disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio, as it is stated, it is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar, from which he derives, just as with regard to a burnt offering which is fit for the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend. So to any item that is fit for the altar, if it ascended, it shall not descend. And so the Mishnah now comments, well, the difference between the statement of Rabban Gamliel and the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua is what? Didn't it sound pretty similar? Well, says the Mishnah, the difference between them is only with regard to disqualified blood and disqualified libations. Does blood go up on the altar? No. Blood gets presented on the side of the altar, and its remainder is poured on the base of the altar. What about libations? The water libation of Sukkot or wine libations that are brought at other times during the year, they're either on the side of the altar, or there is a place for them on the top of the altar, and there are actually some holes in the altar into which those libations are poured for their sacrifice on the altar. Is only with regard to disqualified blood and disqualified libations, which are not consumed by the fire, but do ascend upon the altar. As Rabban Gamliel says, they shall not descend, as they are fit to ascend upon the altar. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, they shall descend, as they are not burned on the altar. Right? There are things that have a place on the altar, but are not burned there. Rabbi Shimon says whether the offering was fit and the accompanying libations were unfit, for example, if they became ritually impure, tameh, or they were brought outside their designated area, or whether the libations were fit and the offering was unfit, rendering the accompanying libations unfit as well. And even if both this and that were unfit, the offering shall not descend, as it was sanctified by the altar, but the libations shall descend, because they are not items that are burned, therefore they are not suited for the altar. If they went up, they come back down. That's the Mishnah. Now we're in 83b and doing the Gemara on this Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches that the altar sanctifies items that are suited to it, from which the Gemara infers items that are suited to the altar, yes, they are sanctified by it, and therefore even if they are unfit, they remain on the altar, they don't come back down. But items that are not suited to the altar, no, they are not sanctified by it, and they descend from it even after ascending. So the Gemara asks, this inference serves to exclude what? So Rav Papa said it serves to exclude handfuls of flour that were removed from meal offerings by a priest in order to be burned on the altar, right? When an offering is a meal offering, fine flour, right, wheat flour, how do they deal with that? It comes up in a service vessel. The priest reaches into that, takes a handful. It's a very specific way of doing it with these 3 fingers, right, which he smooths out with the thumb and pinky. And then this, the chametz, that's placed in a separate service vessel, and that is going to be burned on the altar pyre. So it serves to exclude handfuls of flour that were removed from meal offerings by a priest in order to be burned on the altar, and that were not sanctified by being placed in a service vessel before they ascended. He didn't put it in a service vessel to bring it up. I guess he just brought it up in his hand. Those handfuls did not yet become suited for the altar, and therefore they shall descend, right? They're not yet suited for the pyre, even though ultimately they would go there because they weren't brought up in a service vessel. Ravina objects to Rav Papa's question. In what way is this case different from that of Ula? As Ula says, sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity that one offered up on the altar before the sprinkling of the offering's blood and are therefore not yet suited for the altar shall not descend, as they have become the bread of the altar. They have been sanctified such that they must be burned. Right? Very interesting. If you're talking about animal offerings, when are they ready for the altar pyre? After their blood is presented on the side of the altar. If they brought up those sacrificial portions for burning before the blood was presented, it's not yet ready for the altar. And nevertheless, since these are, meat portions of offerings that are ultimately destined for the altar pyre, if they were brought up prematurely, the altar sanctifies them and they do not descend. So why don't we say the same about the handful from a meal offering that was not yet suited for bringing up on the altar because it wasn't placed in a service vessel? Okay, it was brought up prematurely without a service vessel, but now that it's here, why don't we leave it up there? And the Gemara responds that there is a difference between the cases. These sacrificial portions described by Ula do not lack the performance of an action with regard to themselves that will render them fit for the altar. Right? The meat is waiting for the blood to be presented on the altar, on the side of the altar, but the meat is not waiting for a different packaging to be brought up onto the altar pyre. Whereas that flour, it's not waiting for something else to happen. It's waiting for itself to be packaged in the right container, the service vessel. Right? By contrast, these handfuls mentioned by Rav Papa lack the performance of an action with regard to themselves, as they have yet to be sanctified through placement in a service vessel, and that's why they have not become fit and never do become fit for the altar. New topic. The Mishna teaches that Rabbi Yehoshua says any item that is suited to be consumed by the fire on the altar, if it ascended upon the altar, it shall not descend. As it is stated, it is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar. Right? So the things that ascend and then don't descend, even if they're unfit, are things that are meant to be burned on the altar. That would exclude what? Libations, right? So the Gemara asks, and as for Rabban Gamliel also, who holds that any item suited for the altar, whether it is to be burned or not, shall not descend? Isn't it written in the verse, burnt offering on the pyre? Why doesn't he say that? Why doesn't he agree that only means things that are burned? And the Gemara responds, that verse comes to teach the mitzvah to restore to the pyre any parts of the offering that were dislodged from the pyre, and is not discussing unfit items at all. According to Rabban Gamliel, he's saying that if something that is meant to be burned on the pyre fell off, right? If you ever tended a fire in a fireplace or at a bonfire, when the logs break as they're burning, sometimes things fall. And it could be that a piece of meat that is meant to be consumed by the altar pyre actually fell off the altar pyre. So you put it back. The Gemara asks, and the other Tana, Rabbi Yehoshua, from where does he derive the requirement to restore to the fire sacrificial portions that were dislodged from it? And the Gemara responds, he derives it from the verse that the fire has consumed of the burnt offering on the altar, indicating that items already partially consumed by the fire are restored to it even if they were dislodged so that they can be consumed. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara asks, and the other Tana, Rabban Gamliel, what does he derive from that verse? And the Gemara responds, Rabban Gamliel requires that verse to derive that you return partially consumed parts of a burnt offering to the altar, but you do not return partially consumed parts of an incense offering that fell from the golden altar. As Rabbi Hanina bar Minyumi, the son of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, teaches that the verse that the fire has consumed of the burnt offering on the altar teaches that you return partially consumed parts of a burnt offering that fell from the pyre, but you do not return partially consumed parts of an incense offering that fell from the pyre on the incense altar. The Gemara asks, and the other Tana, Rabbi Yehoshua, from where does he derive this distinction? And the Gemara responds, can it be learned? Can it not be learned by itself from the straightforward meaning of the verse that we restore partially consumed parts of a burnt offering to the altar? Therefore, there is no need for an additional verse, as both laws can be learned from the same verse. And the Mishna teaches that Rabban Gamliel says, with regard to any item that is suited to ascend upon the altar, even if it is not typically consumed, right, not typically burned on the altar, nevertheless, now that it's come up, it won't go down, even if it's not the type of item that is burned. Let me read that again. The Mishna teaches that Rabban Gamliel says, with regard to any item that is suited to ascend upon the altar, even if it is not typically consumed, if it ascended, it shall not descend. Even if it is disqualified from being sacrificed ab initio, as it is stated, it is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yehoshua as well, isn't it written upon the altar and not merely on the pyre? Why does he say that only items that are burned shall ascend and not descend, if they are unqualified? And the Gemara, or disqualified. And the Gemara responds, that term is required by Rabbi Yehoshua to teach what is the reason the merciful one states that any item that is suited for the pyre does not descend from the altar. It is because the altar sanctifies it. So Gemara turns the question back around and asks for the other Tana, Rabban Gamliel. From where does he derive that the altar sanctifies the items that ascend upon it, and that's why they don't descend even if they are disqualified? And the Gemara responds, it is from the fact that the term altar is written another time in the verse, whatever touches the altar shall be sacred, in Exodus 29:37. So the Gemara asks, okay, then back to Rabbi Yehoshua. Why does he require 2 verses to teach the same law, i.e. that the altar sanctifies items that ascend upon it? And the Gemara answers, 1 verse is necessary for a case where an item had a time of fitness for consumption by the fire and was then disqualified, for example, if it became tameh. And 1 verse is necessary for a case where the item did not have a time of fitness. For example, an offering that became disqualified at the moment of slaughter. How could that happen? If the priest had in mind the wrong kind of offering or the wrong owner. So it never was fit. And yet, if it ascends on the altar, we're going to leave it up there because the altar sanctifies it. The Gemara asks, okay, back to Rabban Gamliel. Why does he not require another verse to teach that even items that had no time of fitness shall not descend from the altar? And the Gemara responds, once there are disqualified items that the Merciful One included in the law that they shall not descend from the altar, it is no different if the item had a time of fitness, and it is no different if the item did not have a time of fitness. And now we don't have any further bifurcation of their opinions. One last point here. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Shimon says whether the offering was fit and the accompanying libations were unfit, or whether the libations were fit and the offering was unfit, and even if both this and that were unfit, the offering that went up shall not descend, but the libations shall descend. And now the Gemara elaborates, it is taught in the Baraisa that Rabbi Shimon says, the verse that teaches that fit items shall not descend from the altar states, this is the law of the burnt offering. It is the burnt offering on the pyre upon the altar. From where is it derived? Just as a burnt offering, which is an item that comes upon the altar for its own sake, shall not descend, so too all items that come upon the altar for their own sake shall not descend. And excluded are libations which come upon the altar for the sake of the offering they accompany, not for their own sake, right? That's the difference between an animal offering. It comes on the altar for its own sake. Libations aren't brought separately according to this opinion. Therefore, why don't we, and that's why they'd come down according to this opinion. They didn't come up for their own sake. They only came up as an accompaniment to an animal offering. That's where we will knock off. I think there are no questions, but I'm going to double check. Yeah, Gary says, I like how Leviticus says, if you don't have the means, you can give a handful of choice flour. God is compassionate. Thank you for your devotion. Right, and not all offerings are that way, but yes, there are variable offerings where the poor could bring a much less expensive version of the offering than the rich. That's why we have meal offerings in those situations. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, see you tomorrow, Thursday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.